Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Makis, co-host of this evening's event with the poet Rory Waterman. The event is part of NTU's Formations programme, which brings together writers, academics and activists whose work addresses inequalities of different kinds. Tonight we are delighted to welcome Andre Naffis-Sahely. He is a poet, editor, translator and lecturer at the University of California. His poetry collections include The Promised Land, Poems from Itinerant Life, published by Penguin Books, and High Desert, published by Blood Axe Books. He has also edited Heart of a Stranger, an anthology of exile literature, is editor of Poetry London, and has been involved in many other writing-related projects. Andre, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your life before I hand over to Rory a bit later. I was very interested to learn that you were born in Venice, that your mother's Italian, your father's Iranian, that you were raised in Abu Dhabi, and that you've lived in many places, including the UK, I believe, and also now you're based in the USA. And I just wanted to ask you, is there somewhere you call home, and why?
Hi, Eve, and thank you so much for the lovely introduction and the question too. And hello, Rory. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. Yeah, you know, I actually, I mean, this I suppose will come a little bit later on in the program, but I'm going to be reading poems from my first book, and I really wanted to read poems from the third section of the book, which is really a bunch of reflections that I wrote around various themes, very historical poems, and I never read from that section of the book, partly because it's one that I don't get much of a chance to discuss, but I do love the quote that opens that section, which is "History is my only country." So I think to answer your question, although I feel as though I belong to several different parts of the world for several different wonderful and unfortunate reasons, I feel like history is really my only country in many ways. Partly for the answers that it gives us on the human condition. God, that sounded terribly pretentious, but I hope it gets a point across.
No, I mean, is there one place where you feel more comfortable, or are you just sort of a citizen of the world?
I think citizen of the world, despite my objections to the construct of citizenship, I think citizen of the world is more accurate. Although I feel like I'll always feel like a bit of a Londoner, I think, partly because of the number of years I spent there. So it's a city that I always go back to. I'm very fond of. I'm actually moving back next year. So
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure Rory will be pleased to hear that. So, I mean, I know that also from what I've read and what I've heard, I know that there are places where you've felt like an outsider in your own home, and I know that you've experienced racism on account of your father's Iranian heritage. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that my father and I had very different experiences. I think that, you know, the racism, let's say, that I discuss in the book is one that I think was very much defined by my experience in the Emirates. I think that despite the fact that Abu Dhabi and Dubai are often seen these days as relatively high-end tourist destinations, what often gets overlooked is the informal, racially based case society that they have going on there, where certain jobs are reserved exclusively for certain ethnicities, and it's a horribly segregated society. It's this bizarre post-colonial continuation of the Raj, I like to think. And I'll probably read some poems that reflect that. So I think that the way that I saw my father being treated in both Italy, where he lived as an immigrant, and in the UAE, where he lived as an altogether different kind of immigrant, one who had to renew his visa every year, despite the fact that he was there for 30 years, I think really shaped the first book. it's really quite encased by the notion of the society that was produced there at that time, and one which I think is on the way out, because I think I was part of this relatively transient historical phenomenon where essentially millions of people were imported, because they're treated like objects really, so they were imported from different parts of the world. In order to construct an oil-producing first world-style society, essentially. And there are already plans being hatched right now to return that country to its so-called original native state, meaning that, at some point in the coming years, millions of people are going to be deported, whether they like it or not, regardless of whether, their families have been there for generations. I mean, living in the Emirates, I was always quite distraught at the fate of Palestinians there, who, some of whom have been there as early as 1948, so there'd be 3 or 4 generations of the same family, and they would still have to renew their visas year on year and always face the prospect of being deported for whatever reason, because you become too old, or because you're no longer employable in various ways, or perhaps because you broke some minor law that in any other country would have meant perhaps a fine, but instead there it means that your entire life just disappears because your visa's revoked, you're forced to leave your family. So I think that my father belonged to a relatively privileged category, in the sense that he was a lower middle class professional, and I think that gave him a certain status, but he was nonetheless Iranian, and there exists quite a difficult political complication between the United Arab Emirates and Iran, which is really over a territorial issue. But yeah, I think my father's experience helped me define the part about the United Arab Emirates, and then my own experience, I think, fed in more to the early years, my upbringing in Italy. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to hearing about how these experiences sort of informed your poetry. But because I think that Rory's sort of going to talk about the poetry and about craft and technique and that sort of thing, I wanted to talk about some of the other things that you do that are also connected to writing. So I want to talk a little bit about your role as a translator of both fiction and poetry, which I feel must be incredibly difficult thing to do. I don't think people realise just how hard it is. I mean, I was recently asked to translate the Greek word Iliovasileman into English, and it means sunset. But the actual word in Greek is something like, it's a combination of 2 words, which is sun's kingdom. So in the English translation, it doesn't quite capture the beauty of the word. And I'm sure that you sort of come across this sort of the difficulty of translating certain words from certain cultures into other languages. Could you talk to us a little bit about the challenges of translation? And also whether you feel that you have to be a poet to translate poetry and a fiction writer to translate fiction.
I think, I'll answer the last part of your question first. I think it definitely makes sense. I think there are definitely a lot of benefits to being a poet when you're translating poetry, because personally, whenever I've looked at authors that I thought I might be able to translate, I always search for various affinities in style and thematic direction, perhaps even political concern when translating their work, to find the kind of similarities that I would need to bridge the distance created by language. But I think the role of a translator came easily to me in some ways, in the sense that growing up in the Emirates, it's a polylingual society, one where speaking 2 or 3 or more languages is not exactly strange at all. And so I feel like in some ways I fell into it for the sheer fact that I had to learn several languages when moving to the Emirates as a child. Can
I just jump in there? Yeah. So did you learn those languages formally or informally?
Both formally and informally, I think, at different stages. So I was very lucky. Around the age of 9 or 10, the Emirati government decided that, contrary to standard practice up until that point, all children of foreign nationals would have to take compulsory classes in Arabic. It was a wonderful scheme that I think only lasted for about 3 or 4 years, but it was long enough for me to pick up the language and then carry on its practice informally. So I studied languages at different periods, but none of them, let's say, too formally beyond a basic stage. Everything I learned really was from an autodidactic point of view. So picking up books and trying to form an opinion of what I liked, essentially, what I thought that I could deliver, using my own skills as a writer, which admittedly, when I first started translation, were far more limited than they are now. Yeah.
So do you find it? Do you still find it sort of challenging to translate, works from other, into other languages? Do you find it challenging?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the difficulties vary from book to book, and I think one of the greatest jobs I have to do whenever before translating an entire book is putting in several months of research to really trying to acquaint myself as best I can with the environment that the author was shaped by or the book was shaped by. I spent a large part of my late 20s translating Moroccan novels and Moroccan poetry, and I spent quite a long time living in the country, in various different cities, in order to be in closer touch with the authors and learn more about their culture, and also be attuned to the linguistic quirks that every specific dialect or certain specific cultural connotations have. But I think when it comes to summing up the modern world, as poets often try to do, I think this is an experience that is more and more becoming polylingual. I recently judged a literary prize called To Speak England in different languages, and it was sponsored by the Babel Festival in Switzerland. And one of the entries that I was most drawn to was that of it was a poem written by a Chadian immigrant who just arrived in the UK. I'm not sure exactly how long she's been in the UK. I gather at least a few months. And she produced this wonderful poem that was essentially an itinerary of her journey from her native home to the UK and her experiences as a refugee. And it was a poem that was composed in 5 languages. So 2 native Chadian languages, then the Chadian Arabic, which is a Chadian twist on standard Arabic, and then you have English and French. So I think that more and more as we look at the experiences of people with more global backgrounds, these are experiences that can only be summed up in various different languages. So I think
and the anthology that you edited, I believe that there were works translated from 25 languages. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, and how were those works chosen? So this was an anthology, an amazing anthology called Heart of a Stranger, an anthology of exile literature. How did you go about sort of choosing the pieces? Was that part of your role as the editor to sort of reach out to writers and select the pieces for the anthology?
Well, absolutely. I think, it was one of the chief joys, really. I think the book really, I try to say this as often as I can because it really is the truth. But I'm always going to be grateful to the editors at Pushkin Press for publishing this and what needed to happen for the book, essentially, because there wasn't a gigantic budget for permissions or one at all, really. And so there were certain texts that I was obliged to leave out for the fact that they would have been too expensive to procure. But what that led me to do was to reach out to this informal network of translators that I built up over the years while being a translator myself. And it's a book that was really built on their generosity. So a lot of the poems in the book, let's say, were pieces that the translator was really attached to, but hadn't been able to publish for whatever reason. And so they were passion projects for a lot of them. But it allowed me to assemble what is basically, I like to think of it as a history of human civilization told through the literature of exile. And yeah, again, I think I was very lucky to be able to draw on the expertise of about 30 or 40 different translators. So the book is really here thanks to them.
Yeah. I was wondering whether you would read one of the poems for us, and I think it sort of exemplifies the collection, and I actually love the way you read it as well. I've heard you read it. And I'd love to hear you read it again if that would be okay. So it's a poem called 99 Names of Exile, and I'll hand over to you, André.
Thank you, Eve. So yeah, this is a poem written by the Iranian American poet Kaveh Basiri, who actually won a prize for the poem, I think after I picked it up for the anthology, and it's the title poem of this lovely pamphlet that he published as well, also called 99 Names of Exile. So thank you, Kaveh, as well, for allowing me to publish it. Adam and Eve, afflicted, afraid, alien, banished, beggar, castaway, colonist, condemned, crippled, dangerous, dark, deportee, deserter, detested, different, dirty, disgraced, disinherited, dismissed, disowned, displaced, dispossessed, dyke, emigrant, ethnic, evil, exotic, expatriated, expelled, extraterrestrial, foreign, forsaken, fugitive, guilty, heretic, homeless, homesick, impure, infectious, inhuman, insurgent, invisible, Ishmael, Jew, Kashmiri, lost, malefactor, marooned, mysterious, nigger, non-citizen, non-conformist, other, outcast, outlaw, outsider, overseas, pariah, queer, refugee, resident alien, runaway, scapegoat, squatter, stateless, stranger, street Arab, terrorist, traitor, trespasser, unclean, uncorrectable, undesirable, undomesticated, unfit, unfortunate, unidentified, uninvited, unknown, unnamed, unrecognized, unskilled, unspeakable, unthinkable, untouchable, unusual, unwanted, unwilling, unworthy, victim, villain, virus, wanderer, witch, wrong, X, yellow, and zero. So that's 99 names of exile. And
Thank you
for
so
those of
much.
you
Thank
listening,
you.
it's a list poem in 3 columns. So the words are just listed out in columns in alphabetical order, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a poem. It's one of the earliest poems I actually picked for the anthology. So I'm glad you asked me to read it.
Yeah, I think it's
yeah.
particularly relevant at the moment to sort of with things that are going on. But
Well, unfortunately, the relevance is permanent. I think it's something that I tried to point out in the introduction to the book. Unfortunately, exile has never gone out of style. Literature was really born out of exile, right? I mean, the earliest text that we have was written by a woman fleeing her native city, which had just been destroyed. So that's, I think that tells us all we need to know about.
Yeah, that's a really, relevant point, I think. I'd like to hand over to you now, André, and so that we could hear some of your own work. And then after that, we'll introduce Rory. So I'll hand over to you and thank you very much.
Thank you. I wanted to read some poems from The Promised Land. And as I said earlier, I really wanted to read some from the third section of the book, which has this lovely quote by the Hungarian writer Antal Zerb, "History is my only country," prefacing the section. And since we just talked about exile, I thought I would read one of the earlier prose poems I wrote for this sequence. It's called Patience. The old Roman emperors knew a thing or two about exile. On discovering a poet who had taken too many liberties, or a relative grown uncomfortably popular, they selected an island, ideally somewhere sunny, Africa, perhaps, or a rocky outpost off the coast of Sicily. Then, having chosen a location that was suitably isolated, they dispatched their prisoner there. At first, life wasn't so bad for the new exile. Letters from friends came and went, and slaves catered to their every need. The climate was pleasant, the villa spacious, their allowance ample, and their stay, they were assured, only temporary. The exile was allowed to roam freely within the village, and occasionally they even made friends. As the years went by, a routine of small pleasures would help to mitigate the exile's nostalgia, making their longing almost bearable. Languishing in indolence, however, the exile would grow to look upon his changeless fate as worse than death itself. Finally, when the emperor saw that sufficient time had elapsed, the soldiers were dispatched. Small handfuls of men at arms who, washing ashore on the island under cover of darkness, would bring the long vacation to its promised end. So, it might have been the Roman emperors who came up with revenge as a dish best served cold, I think is the point there. The next poem I wanted to read, the next two actually are still from the same section. And it occurred to me when writing this sequence that whenever we think of the downfall of civilizations, of empires, we always look for the moments that we believe best summed up the end, right at the end of the decline. So you're looking at the last Roman emperor playing with pigeons rather than dealing to affairs of state, or Napoleon marching into Venice and bringing the Republic to an end after 1,000 years. But it struck me that the more interesting moments, the ones that had the most to impart to us as lessons, really came in the earlier stages of the declines. And this poem is called The Crisis of the Third Century. They were dying, the Romans, and they knew it. Fewer sandals took to their roads, and wars were getting pricier, bloodier, less satisfying too. Once fear got a hold of the Romans, it never released them. Their solution was walls, higher walls, the blind ecstasy of mortar and brick. The more spirited ones threw lavish parties, orgies, their spirits sinking as each of their guests abandoned sinful pleasures for the sanctity of the cross. Some blamed it all on the polluting barbarians, and edicts were passed to outlaw the mixing of races. Of all their flawed remedies, it would be their last. And then this one's called The Pagan's Lament, and it's a monologue that I wrote, and I'll leave the historical figure's name unmentioned because I like to leave that to people to find out. But it's called The Pagan's Lament, and this poem is written in her voice. The Christians burned down my father's school, and across the sea, by the mouth of the Nile, they butchered a colleague of his in her classroom. I'm told she was beautiful, curly locks, full lips, and a mind as bodacious. Unlike my old father, I keep my opinions to myself. My husband fervently believes in a God who some describe as jealous, a murderer even. My husband's friends frighten me. Last night, they slaughtered a man for insisting an angel might also be called a nymph, one of the finer points of their canonical law. Today, I heard my husband say that a rational woman was a sign of decadence, of end times. I see dark days ahead for my kind. So yeah, I often don't get to read from that last section of the book, but I thought I'd do so today before dipping into the Emirates. I grew up in the Emirates from the age of about 7 up until 19, when I then relocated to the UK to go to university, and then I just stayed on in the UK after that. But this is a poem I often like to read as introducing how life there felt like, and it's called Vanishing Act. Only 2 out of 10 people die in Abu Dhabi. The rest simply fail to have their visas renewed. They are bagged, tagged, and placed on the next available flight to wherever they first came from. The one-way ticket experience par excellence. Every edifice on this island is crafted by these almost nothings. In death, at least, there is solace. Never again to queue for days on end. Never again to have their fingertips inked and pressed by intolerant hands. Their blood screened for undesirable illnesses. Their flesh seared by a sun that wonders what the hell they're doing there. I wanted to follow on with that poem with one that described the experience of returning to the Emirates, because even though I'd spent most of my life there, and the fact that my father's worked on and off there since 1980, so a good 40 years, whenever I would return following the end of my residence permit, I would always have to re-enter the country as a tourist. And this one's called The Return. I get stamped in like a tourist. It's 7 a.m. and my father's waiting for me at arrivals. We drive along the impossibly wide highways over the bridge to the island of Abu Dhabi. 60 years ago, there was almost nothing here. A single mud brick fort where the ruler and his family lived, a few brackish wells, an airstrip, and a handful of huts. Now it accommodates 1.5 million people from just about anywhere on Earth and hosts a Formula One Grand Prix. My father pulls up in the parking lot in the middle of Bateen, a residential neighborhood. On entering the 3-story building where he and my mother live, I spot a succession of bright red crosses spray painted on nearly every wall, door, and hallway. It's Passover at King Herod's. My father explains that an official from the municipality inspected the building last week and ordered all the partitions torn down in accordance with new planning regulations. Most of the building is held up by light interior walls that sound like ripe watermelons when you rap your knuckles against them. The municipality has given my parents 2 days to knock down the walls, or they'll cut off their gas, water, and electricity. Over the years, my family has acquired a breathtaking proficiency in paring their lives down to the bare essentials. Living in the United Arab Emirates is like assembling a Jenga tower, then nervously trying to remove as many blocks as you can without the entire edifice collapsing on you. Once the walls are gone, my parents will get a reprieve from the city authorities, like the rest of their anxious fellow tenants, at which point the game starts all over again. Moving on from the Emirates, I wanted to read a couple of poems that I wrote right towards the end of the time when I was writing The Promised Land, and they're about my early years in the U.S., where I was living in upstate New York, in these fairly isolated, sort of rural, mountainous communities. And there's one that I wanted to dedicate to my partner, Zinzi, because it's dedicated to her in the book too. And it's called In the Catskills. We were trapped in a town called Liberty. Our cabin lay on top of a hill where the snow kept us caged for entire weeks at a time. Down the dirt road, past a couple of bends, lay the hamlet of Neversink, which of course had been drowned by a reservoir. It was hard to think of anything human around us as serious. All man had built reeked of failure and rust. We lived amidst the ruined remnants of a Yankee frontier town, slumbering mills, silent railroads, idle factories, gutted houses, a few drowsy strip malls. It was the nonsensical heart of angry America, where descendants of Unionists proudly flew Dixie flags, despite the dark man in the White House. The one half-decent bite to eat was at Stu's, a blue Coleman diner, formerly on 49th and 11th, that got pushed out by franchises, then exiled upstate on a flatbed, never to return. When the mulch plant shut down, the sons and daughters of Liberty debated at length the great prospects before them, casinos or fracking. But the rich second homeowners fought the oil men and won, so casinos it was. Liberty, son, an old school teacher told me, is where the past comes to die. Ain't it funny to think, my beloved, that this was where our future began? I wonder if I've got time for another poem, perhaps. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. Yeah, good. This is a poem that I actually, it was one of the earliest that I wrote for the book. In fact, it may have been the very first one. And the reason that I decided it was the first for the new book is because I felt that it made me look terrible. And I think that that's something that poets should be comfortable doing sometimes. And so, yeah, I'll read it. It's called A Kind of Love. We loved luxury and ate like pigs, but our room, unborn as yet, was bare. It was a new building, and when we moved in, the landlord looked us over and said, "No noise after 11, please." Obediently, for the most part, we adhered and kept the ancient record player, among the only things of mine to survive the neglect and the moths, at its lowest. Although money was scarce, vinyl records were cheap, and we took advantage. Halfway through the tenancy, I got your name mixed up with another woman's, and quite rightly, without a word, you left me there, taking little else except the needle you knew full well was irreplaceable, unlike our short-lived kind of love. Yeah, and I think I might leave it there, actually, unless there's more time. But how am I doing, Eve? Yeah, okay.
I think it's over to me. Is that right? I was going to ask for more, but maybe we'll have time for that at the end. We'll see. Yeah, thanks, Andre. Thanks for the reading, old and new work. I just want to remind people in the audience to put questions in the chat if you have them, and I'll make sure we get to those. You can put them. I don't exactly know, but you can put them in the feed, and our colleague, who's a wonderful tech wizard, Josh Lockwood Moran, will somehow relay them to me, and I'll relay them to Andre, and everything will be good. Obviously, Andre, we've known each other for a long time now, so 13 years, something like that. And your first book, I know, was a collection of essays that you co-edited on the poet Michael Hoffman, and you're very much your own poet. But there's the mark of Hoffman in some of your rhetorical flourishes, sometimes the form, quite often the form as well, I think, and to some extent your frequent, I suppose, documentary style. Do you think that's fair comment? But what did Hoffman mean to you as a young poet starting out, particularly?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I like, this is something I always say to my students. I think that there are some poets that you love and some poets that you love and learn from, and just other poets that you learn from, and that's it. Yeah. And I think Hoffman was a poet that I both loved and learned from. I think in a way he was my, I wonder if he's, if he would agree with this, but he was my gateway drug to Robert Lowell, as I think he was to other poets who picked him up while not necessarily knowing Lowell's work. So I think I was always drawn to a certain documentary style approach to poetry. Although one of the earliest poets I fell in love with was Cesare Pavese, who was, sure, took a documentary approach, but took it in a very lyrical, very emotive direction. But I feel like I learned a lot from Hoffman, and if I had to do it all over again, I think I'd stick to that path. There was something very appealing about the way that Hoffman not only chronicled his life, but was willing really to air dirty laundry, which is where I felt the devilish details that we need to make a poem work emotionally were really present. I never got over watching that documentary that was produced by the BBC, I think in the late 80s, early 90s. It was in the Bookmark series put together by Ian Hamilton. And there was this documentary called My Father's House, which was the name of the sequence from Michael Hoffman's Acrimony, his second book, his famous second book, where essentially it showed Hoffman Jr., so Michael, going to see his father, Gerd Hoffman, who was also a novelist. And the documentary captured the intellectual fervor in that house, and also showed the personal fallout, because I think that when you write about people in a way that attempts to arrive at a certain kind of reality, you're going to ruffle feathers. I think any writer that writes confessionally will tell you that they've had problems dealing with the people that, and I think especially when you decide to turn that clinical approach, that lens on your own family, on your own friends, then I think it can lead pretty interesting consequences and turmoil sometimes. But that's what I felt made it worthwhile, because it's when you're putting in that level of risk that I think the are there. I mean, that sounds horribly cynical, but I think the point to try, for me at least, assembling a poem was always about trying to archaeologically resurrect a moment through the literary imagination for someone else to be able to relate to, and they can never really fully relate to it. But if you map the environment in a certain way, I think it increases their chance of doing so.
Yeah, I agree with so much of what you say there, and a lot of it just makes me sing. I think we're very different poets, but I think there's a similar a kind of truth, and to not worry if you ruffle a few feathers by doing so. And regarding Pavese, yeah, big influence on me too, albeit in translation, of course. And this makes me think. I wasn't really going to ask about this. Eve has asked you about translation, but Hoffman, the translator, right? Andre Naffis-Sahely, the translator. Is there any connection there? Did he think, yeah, I can do that too, and I want to?
I got to be honest. I had the pleasure of having an interview with Hoffman when I was writing a PhD on his work, which is where really my fascination of his work began. But we never discussed translation, and I think he didn't serve as a model in the sense that I think Hoffman tends to specialize in a certain period. I think essentially the silver age, so-called silver age of German literature in the early 20th century. I think that's his sweet spot. Yeah. And I think my project was always essentially looking at the periphery of the Francophone world, the so-called periphery. So, Francophone writing from the Caribbean, North Africa. So our languages were different, our directions were different. But I think in a way he was definitely inspirational in the sense that he showed me that a life could be led that way, that you could make a living essentially out of that. I think given the background I had, I think I always felt certain financial pressures. And so as much as I wanted to devote myself to literary translation, seeing someone like him be able to make a living out of it, to keep going over the years, I think definitely gave me the inspiration to go forward with that. But I think that was the extent of it, really.
But it wasn't just a financial imperative, right? Because I know I interviewed you for peer review, and
there would have been easier ways of making money.
Quite. But I interviewed you for peer review, and I asked you what the financial imperative, what part that played, and you said, well, I'm paraphrasing you now, but you said Yes, to some extent, of course, but no, not really, because you have to love and want to engage with the work for it to work at all. And now I think of some of the poets you've translated. Now, excuse I'm from Lincolnshire, André, as you know, my pronunciation of English isn't very good, but your translation, say, of Abdul Latif Laibi, has that those sorts of translations? That is a particularly wonderful book, which we wouldn't have if you hadn't done that for Carcanet about 3 years ago, I think. Has that sort of close engagement with the text affected your writing, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think, so I worked as a literary translator full time for about 6-7 years. And the way it worked is translating novels would pay for translating poetry. So that's how the mechanics of that worked. With Abdul Latif Laibi, I think that he was the poet I had most kinship with in many ways. He and I met over the years. And I think there was a political overlap. There was a thematic overlap. There was, a certain stylistic overlap, not too broad a one, because I think Abdul Latif's journey as a poet has been incredibly fascinating. I mean, his earliest poems are very avant-garde, very influenced by Stéphane Mallarmé, really place themselves almost in, let's say, the North African version of negritude in the 60s and 70s, really drawing on surrealism, that post-colonial moment. And then he essentially progressively got more lyrical and more direct with his use of language. And now he's writing poems that are deceptively plain, very straightforward, very affecting. And so, working with him was a privilege. Not that we worked directly on the translations, but he was definitely an inspiration, I think, for how a poet's life should be lived. Although I hope to not spend 10 years in prison the way he did, but he was living in a very different context. I mean, he spent most of the 70s in prison for, what they called at the time crimes of opinion. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe you could have some crimes of opinion depending on what the state regards as that. Your first collection, there's loads more I'd like to ask about him really and that relationship. But your first collection, The Promised Land, is subtitles "Poems from an Itinerant's Life," and there it is on the front cover with I think a ship, the back, the wake of a ship, sort of cutting everything in two. You've certainly lived an itinerant life, more than anyone else I know, I think. I'm pretty sure about that. But you do use the word home about the United Arab Emirates, about the UAE. And one poem in the book is called Home After 5 Years, something like that. Yeah, Home After 5 Years. And it ends with a vision of home swelling like a cancer below the plane as you take off. If the UAE is home doesn't seem to be where the heart is, right? Could you say a few words about your relationship to the country and how you reflect that in your work, and has the presentation of the United Arab Emirates and your life there caused you any problems that you'd be happy to talk about?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I think I can definitely unpack that. When it comes to the Emirates, I feel that part of the reason, I think I said this not too long ago at another reading, actually, where in a sense I wrote this book to prove that I'd been there in the first place. I think that through our actions, we're always trying to prove something, and especially with writing a book like this, I think part of the idea really was to say, no, I actually, despite what the government might say or the way that the society is ordered, this is my way of saying that I was here, I lived here, I had a perspective on it. Because I always felt that the country felt like one giant revolving door. Earlier when I was talking to Eve about the fact that essentially at the moment there's about 10 million people in the UAE. 90% of them are foreigners, most of them short-termers. They may be there for a year or two, but there's still quite a few people who, like I said earlier about various Palestinian people I knew whose families have been there for 3 or 4 generations. There was a political dissatisfaction in me that I wanted to resolve in the book, namely that I felt that these were people who did have a right to remain. And so calling the Emirates a home is a political statement insofar as I wanted to make it in that way, to say that I'd been there in the first place. Something that really inspired me actually was meeting another fellow Abu Dhabian writer, Deepak Unnikrishnan, the fiction writer, who published a novel called Temporary People. And I feel like that's a perfect appellation for people who, like me, I think were indelibly shaped by the multicultural society of the UAE, and I think in many ways would have gladly stayed longer. I don't know exactly for how much longer, but I definitely would have stayed longer. I mean, the Emirates was a home to me in a way that Italy never was. And to this day, because of having moved around so much, I think that I still look upon the Emirates as essentially a very complicated home, but one that I felt I had to critique purely because of the fact that I see that short-term project of immigration coming to an end. I mean, the governments there are already making plans for essentially making sure that most foreigners are forced to leave the country within the next 10 to 20 years. And so, I think part of the real motivation with writing the book, and Poems from Itinerary in Life was a subtitle that the publisher picked. It's one that I was fine with, but I think that the whole point behind calling the book The Promised Land is that promised lands essentially are fictions. They're stories that we tell one another, and so the book is both an attempt for me to say, look, my home is this sort of strange time bubble that is only going to exist for a few decades, and once it's gone, it's just gone forever. And so I wanted it to be a chronicle of that experience, but also to fight against the notion of home itself, because I think that home is really something that can change overnight depending on the kind of person you are and what happens to you. And so it was trying to push both of those ideas at the same time. I don't know whether it succeeded or not, but
no, I think you do. I really think it's a remarkable book, and most debut collections are a ragtag of different bits. I mean, I know mine is, and yours has a unity, which is, I think, is very striking. The United Arab Emirates must have changed a lot since you were a child as well. So I mean, it's a country just through all the building, apart from anything else, just the physical environment of the country, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I can say quite dispassionately that I think it's one of the true engineering marvels of the late 20th century. I mean, it witnessed the construction of a first world class state within 30 years, probably even fewer. And so, the change has been remarkable. I think the core issues have remained the same. The informal apartheid kind of racial caste system that they've got going on, I think, has remained the same. I think population numbers have swelled far beyond the predictions they had in the 70s when they first started extracting oil commercially. And I think that their experience with immigration, I think, can really set the tone for that topic moving forward in the coming decades, because essentially the way that foreign workers are treated in those boom economies, whether related to whichever sort of industry you may think, whether it's metals or oil, I think will really define how we treat people overall, because essentially we're talking about a class that, depending on their ethnicities, because European immigrants to the UAE belong to this very privileged category, whereas you would say, so immigrants instead from the sub-Indian continent, I think, are really occupy a category of transient non-citizens that get shuffled from one market to the other depending on where they're needed, and once they're used up like old batteries, then they're just discarded. And they often find themselves in situations where their host government doesn't want to do anything to help them, and their home government doesn't want to do anything to help them, because all they're good for is sending remittances home. And so I think that it was that kind of reality that I think really helped shape the book. That's why I always read that poem first, Vanishing Act. Only 2 out of 10 people die in Abu Dhabi, because the rest just disappear. They vanish.
Did you worry about what sort of welcome you might receive in the UAE after writing about that so frankly? It's quite an authoritarian government.
Yeah, I mean, the book is informally banned there, so it's not available on sale. And I've had several people write in actually pointing that out. And in fact, the colleague I mentioned earlier, Deepak Unnikrishnan, I think his book is also not available on sale, despite the fact, by the way, that he teaches at NYU Abu Dhabi. So that shows you the irony of the place. I think they've always enforced a relatively mild system of censorship. So, they won't make the book available for sale, but I doubt that they would give me any real problems. I tend to get questioned quite a lot at airports, but, that happens to me whether I'm in the UK or the US, so it's not.
I know. I've heard plenty about that. My next question. No, it's not their fault. My next question, there's one in the chat now, so I'll come to that in a minute. But my next question is really inspired by your last poem. I often find your poems very movingly frank, and you use the word confessional, which I wasn't going to use because it feels like an old saw, but I think that's true. How did some of the people that you've written about in that first book feel about your presentation of them, and how do you feel about your presentation of yourself? You're not a poet who presents himself as a hero, and in fact, like you said about that last poem, it makes you look terrible. I don't think it does, by the way. I think it makes you look real, and it makes me believe you. But the question remains: how do you feel about the way you present yourself? Do you have any concerns about that, and how have people felt about the way you might have presented them?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, we all know truth is subjective, right? I think I keep going back to the quotes that preface each section, but I do like the one that prefaces the second section, which is André, where he writes, "It was neither true nor false; it was lived." So what I'm giving is not so much the record of the truth, but a chronicle of a life lived. So I think I was stayed away from the definition of, from the attempt to establish a proof that could be verified, a reality that is certified, so to speak. The people I talk about in my book, namely my family, I think, and on very rare occasions, friends, I think did not really react that positively. Although I'm happy to say they also didn't react too negatively. I definitely sadly know quite a few writers who wrote similarly confessional books, and they had family members launch lawsuits against them. So I think I was definitely on the luckier end of the spectrum.
So no lawsuits, no penury of that.
No lawsuits whatsoever. Although I think perhaps what makes it easier is that I don't think anyone in my family could afford a solicitor anyway. So I think that probably forestalled any issues there. But I think that whenever you write about someone, you're incurring those sorts of risks. And I did write about difficult subjects in the book. I mean, my father having an affair and its effect on my mother, for instance. And I can tell you that my mother did not appreciate my airing out certain kind of dirty laundry. But I think that, this is also the stuff of life, I think that to me, a poem, in order to have an emotional engine that can really affect readers, needs to dig deep. And I dug as deep as I felt I could or should without really hurting people, because I think that, for example, what I mentioned earlier, the affair, while that can be a hurtful reality, there was nothing in that poem I felt that really necessarily made anybody look terrible.
No, your poems are, and the poem is empathetic. The poem is empathetic, but the decision of whether to reveal is taken from someone else, and there's obviously a tension there. But I feel it too. I understand that. There's a question from Jenny Ramon. Do you think there's such a thing as a global or world poet? And if so, do you consider yourself to be one?
Good question. Thank you. I do consider myself to be a global poet, and I think there is such a thing. However, I think it's a category that's still relatively small, and it's one that's being continuously built over time. So I think that it's a category that's only going to grow, essentially. One of the texts actually included in the anthology was an excerpt from a prose book written by the South African poet Breiten Breitenbach, where he writes about this middle world of exile where you've unmoored yourself from whichever nationalities you happen to be attached to via the accident of birth, and you move towards a level of existence where you are still informed by those realities, but you've moved beyond them, and there's no such thing as going home. And I think accidents of circumstance can help shape that kind of life. I think in a way, much of the foundations that led me to at least thinking that I see myself as a global poet were laid there by where my parents decided to earn a living, where they decided to move to. So these were factors that I didn't really have a hand in shaping. I think sometimes we just get swept along, but it is a direction that I think I further sharpened, because I think after being raised that way, I felt it was natural for me to keep going on in that manner. And so, yeah, it's a label I'm comfortable with, but Yeah, and I think it's a category that's only meant to grow in the future. So, where essentially a single, or even two realities don't really quite encase the poet's experience or life. Yeah.
Yeah. You and I, we're both reviewers. We both write quite a lot of reviews and have done for a long time. For pretty much all the time we've been publishing poems, really, and mainly reviews of contemporary poetry. And do you think that engagement with poetry in that way has had much of an impact on your own poetry, or on how you put books together, or anything like that?
You know what? So editing magazines was something that I wouldn't say necessarily fell into, but it's not something that I envisioned doing earlier on. So it's a recent development, but it's been wonderful. You know, I've heard it said by some editors that, in a sense, putting together magazines filled with excellent work, at least insofar as they see it's excellent, was really negative to their craft, because basically coming across such wonderful poems, you then start thinking, you know, can I compete with all this great talent out there? Do I have the time to then put into my own work? But I found it really inspiring. You know, I think publishing work for various different backgrounds, ages, I think it's just something that eggs me on further. You know, so yeah, it's been great doing that. And I think being critically aware of what works you're trying to do is important. You know, I think that it's sad, you know, we're living in a time when newspapers and magazines are cutting review pages almost by the day. And it's something that we should really try to fight against, I think. I mean, I know you share that feeling.
Yeah, I do. I passionately share that feeling. You're now the editor of Poetry London, 2 issues and thus far, including the 100th issue, which was superb and hardback and huge and must have taken a lot of effort on your part. But how has your flagrant internationalism affected your editorship, do you think? I mean, I know what I think, but I want to hear your views on that.
Yeah, you know, I mean, so the 100th issue, I think, you know, that was really the result of, because, you know, Poetry London had been around 33 years by the time I showed up, you know, obviously. So I was able to draw on this wonderful legacy of poet editors who just, you know, gave us their work, allowed us to republish it. So it's kind of, you know, a chronicle of what Poetry London has done over 30 years. Not a full one, but just a taster, let's say. Yeah. And I think that... I hate to be too simplistic about it, but I think if you're going to edit a magazine called Poetry London that's had such a diverse list of editors, I think that it has to reflect what London is. And London's always been a mother of exiles, you know, a home to the rest of the world. And I think the magazine just needs to reflect that. I think it's done more so at other times than others, but I think that it's always been a part of its core identity, you know. Yeah.
I think you're right, but what do you hope to change in the rest of your editorship, particularly? You know, what do you hope to focus on?
You know, something I'd like to publish more and more of are specially commissioned essays that look at various topics, whether it's, you know, looking at certain books or looking about more the philosophy of what we do as writers. I've been trying to publish more and more on that. In my very first issue, I published an excerpt from a nonfiction book by Fred Aguiar, which I think is, you know, almost a prose poem, really. And it was alongside an excerpt from Maria Stepanova's great book about her family in the former Soviet Union, you know, and the concept of Jewishness as well. So, yeah, that's more of the kind of material that I want to be doing, while still keeping reviews and poems, you know.
But you're already putting a huge stamp on that. I mean, Fred Aguiar's a poet I've admired a lot loved a lot for a long time, but he's not as well known as he should be, and he's not prominent in very many magazines here, and oddly, really. And
agreed.
And you've put that stamp on, but also your desire to you know, to engage in critical conversation and to have a multitude of voices is you know, it's something you were talking about before regarding reviewing, and you said you knew I shared that view, and that's really something you're bringing to your editorship. But you and I have had many slight jump off here, but you and I have had many a political discussion over the years, often late at night, sometimes well fed and lubricated, and you're not remotely an apolitical poet, and in fact I think I'm right in recalling that you considered calling your forthcoming second collection The Last Communist. Is that not right? Which is a title that's bound to make some people angry. And anyway, to what extent is outrage at corporate greed and short-sightedness and the commonplace public lassitude that goes with it a motivation for your writing and editorship? Or writing, really, I suppose.
Great. Love that question. Thank you. Yeah, I think I was always really, I must have been around 14 or 15, and it was around the time I was reading authors like Padeze, where I came across this wonderful quote by the Chilean poet Nicanor Parra, who, of course, being Chilean, had his own political battles to deal with. And he said, a poet must be a thorn in society's side. And I never really got over that. I think that's one of the aspects of our current literary culture that I've always despised, really, is this entire idea of critical reflection not needing a certain axe to grind. And I think that's exactly the point of a critical culture, to have an axe to grind. Yeah. So that's something that I've always wanted to come across, whether I'm putting an issue of Poetry London together or a book or an anthology. There's a reason why the Heart of a Stranger is read. Also because I think, essentially, I know this is quite an American term, but I think in many ways I was a red diaper baby. I come from 3 generations of communists. My grandfather in Iran was one, and so was my father. He had to leave Iran in '79 for that reason. And I'm always thought of myself as a man of the left, although one that's willing to challenge the orthodoxies, which I think has also, led to the left being out of power for so long, as we know. So, yeah.
Yeah, you are not doctrinaire, and I find it very interesting that you say a man of the left and you talk about this legacy of communists, but you don't quite use the term in relation to yourself in that way.
No, absolutely not, because I think you have to maintain your intellectual independence, and to go beyond what's expected. Not to loop back entirely to the other question, but I'm glad you brought up Fred Daguerre, because I think since we were talking about exile today and post-national situations, I think Fred's a very good example of a writer who seems so complex for some people to understand, even though it's all relatively straightforward, in the sense that I think part of the reason he isn't read more widely is that he isn't as easily categorized as we expect sometimes.
Absolutely.
And I'm not talking about the establishment here. I'm talking about the general public as well, because I think there are, to this day, unfortunately, there are some people who find it incredibly difficult to wrap around their mind around the fact that, yes, this is the work of a Guyanese writer whose parents were part of the Windrush generation, is Guyanese British, but now lives in America. And because he's then difficult to pigeonhole from that nationalist point of view, then people go to safer writers, let's say, that don't take them too far outside their comfort zone, So
yeah, that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I think that's so often what representation is taken to mean. You promote someone and you ignore everyone else. I could,
the fact that certain realities are more profitable to work on than others. The number of times that I've heard writers from the subcontinent complain to me saying, I don't want to write about a novel about saris, mangoes, and bindis because that's what a publisher wants me to write. I actually want to write about this. And you can apply that to every other so-called category and community, insert X. And I think fighting against that is just a natural part of what we do. I think should be a natural part of what we do.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree, but we're over time and I could talk to you all night and I have done many a time and I'm sure it will happen again, but thank you very much for your reading and for engaging with me in these questions, and thanks everyone who's here for joining this Formations event for the Post-Colonial Studies Centre and Bonington Gallery at NTU. I know some people are now going to be joining André's workshop, or in 14 minutes time we'll be joining André's workshop. Those of you who are, you're in for a treat, and you have an email which has the sign up links for that. So I'll just say thanks again, and good night everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Eve.